Do you have questions?
Hey, Francis. Is there positive and negative energy, or is it just our perspective that makes it seem positive or negative?
I don't know what you mean by energy.
What about...
To me, that's New Age lingo, which I don't understand.
What about malevolent forces?
What?
Malevolent forces. You know, things that... I didn't think you were going to ask me that, so I'm unprepared. Help. Well, say, I've heard it explained that...
You mean the kind of forces we see when in horror movies?
Not that extreme. But, say, all right, the devil, okay, is a negative force. Is it really negative? Or?
Yeah, but you talk to me about unicorns here, you know. You have to ask the Pope, not me. Because I don't speak of the devil, you see. So you have to ask the Pope and request an exorcism. I don't do that.
I'm out of questions.
Yeah, but I'm sorry, but I don't have an answer to. I could talk about behaviors, for instance, and there are behaviors that are friendly, compassionate, good, you know, that come from the experience of what Plato calls the good. And there are behaviors that come from ignorance, that come from a sense of separation, and as a result, aggression and protection. And perhaps that's what is called evil behavior. But then, if you talk about evil forces that are not related to human behavior, there is only one force, which is the universe, the cosmos, the totality. And that creates the seasons, that creates the flowers and the fruit, and that creates also the tsunamis. I think if you want to stay away from vampires, for instance, you have to do this, or you need some garlic, which is not too good. and and but if you stick to your impersonal nature, vampires won't show up in your life. There are areas that are better left alone and unexplored. Because in a sense, the world appears to us in accordance with our beliefs. And if we don't have any beliefs, the world appears to us as it truly is, and there are no malefic forces. We say maleficent, malefic, malevolent, malevolent force.
I apologize. What about the nefesh, or lower nature?
What about?
Do you...
What about what?
the nefesh, lower nature of ourselves?
What about the flesh, you said?
Nefesh.
You said nefesh.
Never heard of it.
Oh,
Nafesh?
yeah. Okay.
Ça veut dire quoi? L'âme. Nafesh, the soul.
I've had it described as nefesh, no lower nature, good wolf versus bad wolf, which one you feed, blah, blah, blah. The nonsense of the mind. You like that better?
I don't know what to say. I don't know too many things in this realm, so.
Thank you.
Hey, Francis, there's I might get a little bit biblical too. We'll see how it goes. But there's but there, like, just to make another point, I guess, like, there's a prayer, I forget what it's called, but there's a part of it that's, and though I walk through the valley in the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. And it's a bit melodramatic for my day to day, but like the whole "you are with me" bit is quite poignant. More and more, there's kind of this sense of, how do you say? I don't know. It's almost like there's something outside of me that wishes me well. That I don't know. It's kind of looking out for me. Yeah. I mean, I'd call it God, but yeah, there's just a sense of going out in the world with more. I guess a sense of being. I mean, it's good. Like I'm trying to describe something very.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. But.
But it's consciousness.
Yeah.
If you believe to be a separate entity, a limited entity, then there are many things outside of you, right? And in particular, reality is outside of you. So, but reality, in spite of the fact that it is outside of you, it's also within you, and as a result, it's always with you. So this prayer, this saying makes sense to the extent that we identify with the fragment, with the human body-mind, then there is some trust, nevertheless, in a reality which is bigger than this body-mind, which is always with it, and which is in essence benevolent, yes. But we are still in the realm of where we believe that we are a separate consciousness. Therefore, we believe that we are an object. Something. It's like a seeing the light or through a screen. So the screen colors and distorts the light. So we see, and at the same time we don't see clearly. So I'm not saying that there is no intuition of something, of reality. Yes, there is intuition of reality there. It could be called the true religious attitude, yes. And even a form of faith, trust in that sense. But there is still separation. So we have not reached yet spiritual adulthood, if you will. We are a spiritual child who needs the protection of the real adult.
Yeah.
You know?
So what's the screen metaphor?
The screen is that which prevents us from seeing that which we truly are, our real identity is this consciousness which is infinite and limitless and universal.
So that, how do you say, that benevolent presence outside of myself, well, that I perceive to be outside of myself. I mean, is that, well, no, that can't be, you know. I'm sorry, I'm just like thinking out loud, I guess, but I guess I kind of projected onto that, you know, that is the universal consciousness, that is the powerful.
Yeah, but
Right.
you see it as two consciousnesses, one outside of you and one in you, very fragile, which is hearing my words right now.
Yeah.
So what you have to, the possibility you have to be open to is that this seemingly limited, seemingly fragile consciousness, which is hearing my words right now, this reality, is in fact universal. You see, that's the secret, if you will. The open secret. Open because we all share it. We already have it, and we, in a sense, we don't see it. We see it because we know we are conscious. But we superimpose onto it limitations that it doesn't have, that that are simply the product of our imagination. And it is because everything we see is limited that we extend this limitedness of everything we see to that which sees and which we don't see. We are wrong logically or rationally because since we don't see it, how do we know is it limited? You see? The consciousness. Most people believe consciousness to be some kind of thought. That's very weird. That which thinks the thoughts and perceives them is not a thought. And it is real. Whereas thoughts, they are not very real because as soon as you have them, they vanish. So in that sense, they are less real than a table. A table, you see it, and the next moment it's still there. So it's still, a physical object seems to be more permanent, and that leads to materialism, which is the attribution of reality to physical objects. And that can be made possible only by denying consciousness its reality. And the way it is done is first by seeing it as an object, as a thought, which is less real than a physical object. And the trick of the magician has been performed.
Is there a point, though, at which, because I feel like I can catch myself like, you know, well, I'm seeing this thought, and yet I assume it to be me. You know, like
You see the thought, yes, and it is you who sees the thought.
Yeah. And that's, in the seeing, that's the immediate kind.
But you don't see you, yourself, as a thought.
But I don't.
You don't see yourself as a thought.
Mm-hmm.
When you try to experientially experience yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's obviously not a thought. That which perceives a thought is not a thought. Because it is present during the thought.
Right.
And it is still present after the thought. Right?
Yeah.
When a thought is present, if that which perceives a thought were a thought, we would have two thoughts simultaneously present, the perceiving thought and the perceived thought.
Yeah.
But it's not our experience, right?
Yeah.
When a thought is perceived, there is only one thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Therefore, we can conclude experientially from that which perceives is not a thought.
Mm-hmm.
Now, once the thought is gone, that which was perceiving the thought is still present, perceiving other thoughts or perceptions or perceiving itself, right?
Yeah.
So it is not a thought. But nevertheless, most people believe that it is some kind of a thought.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's a twilight zone, it's a zone of confusion. I'm trying to... It's like if you look at something very close without focusing on it, it's kind of blurred. So, but if we focus onto consciousness, this mechanism, and what I said may make sense to you, not intellectually, but experientially, by saying, yes, that's true, that's my experience too.
I think my trouble though is because there are these moments where like I see the thought, and that mechanism of identification just in the seeing it kind of clearly I'm not the thought. So what am I, right?
Yeah, but it doesn't matter, because if you could answer this question with a thought, you would have to be a thought. The problem is that every thought is limited. You see.
Yeah.
And because the consciousness is not limited, this question, what am I, can never be answered with a thought. No matter how beautiful, how big, how infinite this thought is, you see, the thought is never the thing. So, but when we understand that, we have understood something already, you see. That which thinks a thought is bigger than any thought. It's more... But on the other hand, it makes sense to have the desire to acquire something which we don't have. And this attempt to see consciousness is an attempt to acquire something, some knowledge about it, right? Mm-hmm. But to acquire some knowledge about it, with which goal in mind?
So you're asking, so then I've got it, I can hold on to it, like a medallion. And okay.
Because the goal is somehow to acquire consciousness.
Yeah.
But it doesn't make sense because you are it already.
Yeah.
You see?
Yeah.
But it's just that we fall in the old habit of acquisition, of securing something. So when we see that, also, this attempt to acquire that which we already are fall away because it doesn't make sense. So it is not that we have to acquire something, but rather that we have to disacquire something, if you will, if I can coin this word, and disacquire the belief that consciousness, that which we are, is an object or limited by or conditioned by or dependent upon some kind of object. And once this belief is let go of, also to let go of all the habits that were consistent with this belief, that were the result of this belief. So habits that are still there as mechanisms we have acquired and then we can forget.
Like seeking, I mean, just
Like seeking consciousness, for instance. Seeking clarity is a good goal. Seeking understanding, if you will, seeking. But it is very different from seeking a state. You see, often the people, they meditate, or what they call meditate by doing some practice, but the goal is, the assumption is, right now I am in a bad place, but if I do this practice for long enough, then I will switch places and I will be in a good place, you see? And the entire assumption here is faulty. Understanding this mechanism in us, that's liberating. Understanding the pointlessness of these attempts to secure happiness in a state, in an object.
thank you.
Francis, you touched on the idea that we are aware of consciousness, that we know that, but yet we choose to, I think you said play the game, or we have the joke that we're all aware, but we're not talking about it. But obviously in this room where we have so many people that are interested in at least the idea that we aren't separate, are we just, playing like cops and robbers or something, just to, to play like we're boys and girls, or is it more, I don't know what to say further.
But I think the assumption that in this room there are a bunch of ignorant people, and that there is an enlightened one sitting next to the roses. Is itself an ignorant assumption. You see, if you have fallen in love with truth, you are no longer an ignorant of truth. You are a lover of truth. But the words that come from truth, if they come from truth, not from a dead truth, but from a living truth in the moment, you see, then they speak to our heart, they speak to the love in us, and then it's a way of celebrating together. It's not that, after spending 2 years with my teacher, I didn't really have any questions. So why did I attend his retreats for 18 more years? Just because I enjoyed it. It was like a concert to me. And of course it doesn't make sense to the usual way of understanding what an ordinary form of teaching is, which is you go somewhere, you acquire something, and you go back home with that which you have acquired. You see, and but the acquisition of it is kind of painful and requires a lot of effort, but then you go home, you have mastered it. It's not that it works. It has to be just the opposite. It's painless. You go there, you enjoy it. If you enjoy it, you come back. And if you, and without you knowing it, it sticks to you, and I was always happy when I was meeting my teacher. It's not something. It's like my teacher when he was in India, he had met several people. One of them was one in the tantric tradition. His name was Gopinath. And the other one was Anandamayi. And in private, on occasions, he had talked with some disciples about these people. And at the time, they were both alive in India. And then these disciples of Jean Klein went to India and met Anandamayi and was surprised to see that Gopinath was there as a follower, as a disciple of Anandamayi. Then he come back and told Jean, you told me that Gopinath was realized. I went there, he was a disciple of Anandamayi. And then he said, if you knew really Anandamayi, you would understand Gopinath. Is not what is said. I never do that. But this morning, you know, when you do search on YouTube, sometimes they offer you something, and there was Francis Lucille on YouTube. That was suggested. So I clicked on it. And there was a conversation, you know, the comments. And one person was saying, well, Francis is kind of getting exhausted after all these years. And I can understand him because it gets repetitive. So I have news for him. Of course, I say only the same thing all the time. So it shouldn't take too many years to realize that I am. So it's like, you know, it's like the story. The story. It's not the story, it's how the story is told. I always tell the same story. And it's how it is told. The story, you know. He did it, he tried to hide it, then he was caught. That's the story. So what? Another one was saying as a comment that something like I would be better off being a late night show host than an Advaita teacher. I took it as a compliment.
So when I leave here, the way my mind works, the way it functions, is it goes on to the next thing. Driving, traffic, what my next meal is, whatever. And Then the next Saturday comes along, and I'm angry with myself because I haven't done any experiments in truth. And I'm impatient. And that's a story about the past. So I'm not even sure my question is, I would like to, maybe that's my question. Maybe I'm not understanding what the experiment is
I
clearly.
think you're a little harsh on yourself. I'm sure you have done some experiments, but when we do them, we don't necessarily realize that we are doing them. Because, for instance, one type of experiment is to try to think along the new lines and not along the old lines. And the new lines are consciousness being universal. I'm sure you have thought about that.
Yeah, I've thought about that.
So you have thought along the new lines.
Yes, and immediately there's the question, well, how in the world what does that look like? And it sort of feels stymied, a sense of stymie, like if consciousness is universal, what's it like?
I mean, it's like it is now. It's
So the experience right now is the experience of universal consciousness.
exactly. All beings at all times have the experience of universal consciousness. But on top of this experience, they superimpose the belief that this consciousness is not universal. And we have to be precise to define what it means when I say they superimpose the belief that it is not universal. It doesn't mean that at all times they think consciousness is not universal, consciousness is not universal, right? That's not how it works. For instance, you are an American citizen, right? So, at some point you have realized I'm an American citizen. Once that has been established, you don't need all the time to remind yourself, right? But if you travel abroad, you need a US passport to do that, and there are circumstances in which it will remind itself to you around April 15, for instance. So, it is the same here. Once we have this belief to be a separate consciousness, we don't have to remind ourselves. We have adopted it, and it affects, it is superimposed onto it, but at the same time, it is in hiding in the background, so to speak. And it affects everything we think, everything we do, everything we feel. That's the bad news, that it's almost invisible, right? In the same way that most of the time the fact that you are a US citizen is invisible. You don't carry the flag here. But the good news is that the same is true when you realize I was mistaken. The moment you realize, well, perhaps consciousness is not separate, perhaps it's, Francis is telling something which is true, then at that moment an openness gets created in you. And this openness remains in the background in the same way as the belief was in the background. You see? Up until you reject it again. But if we understand how it works, then we don't have to maintain anything. We understand, it creates the openness. The openness is maintains itself without effort on our behalf. It will require an effort, in fact, to deny it, to go back to the restriction. In the beginning, we have a glimpse and immediately we go back to the restriction, but once we understand that it remains open up until we close it again, it gives us a way to immediately go to it, to reopen it, and then to let go, not to try to keep it open, you see. So it doesn't require any effort. Before we thought that, okay, we open it through an understanding, then we have to maintain it open. And as we try to maintain it open, our very effort to maintain it open closes it. It's too complicated.
The effort to maintain it open is that delusional separate self
Right.
trying to wake up.
Exactly, exactly. So
And
the openness is there, wonderful, nothing to do.
And if it collapses back on itself.
Yeah, if it
It's-
collapses back, it's because at some point we choose to go back to the belief that we have some evidence that consciousness is limited. But then since we have gone through this experiment in the past, experiment that leads to this certainty that there is no evidence that it is limited, immediately, even the remembrance of this understanding reopens, reestablishes the openness.
Or just the question you pose, the statement you pose, perhaps it's not limited, and immediately
Yes,
there was
yes,
open.
yes.
This is cool. What's been going on is the struggle to force it open, the struggle to force it open, you know, to look at the memory and
Yeah.
force it open, and that's futile. And to see it that way is so different. Oh,
Yeah.
perhaps I'm lying to myself. Oh, okay, yeah.
How do you say when the police breaks open a door to
Barge in.
not forced entry, that's a technical, to bang a door open,
Break
to
in. Break in.
break down a door. Yeah, yeah. So we have an expression in French, enfoncer les portes ouvertes, break down open doors.
Okay,
To break down open doors.
thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Klaus. Is it correct to say that there are no malevolent and no benevolent forces? Would not benevolent be as much a dualistic term as malevolent? that assumes that there will be two forces, right? But in fact, there is only one benevolent force. In other words, there is no opposite to benevolence. Mihai. Lately, due to various cosmic life conditions such as close loved ones leaving, moving houses, multiple current losses, and relationship transitions, evoked in me deep waves bringing up painful material from the past that I have not fully felt. Feelings of fear, loss of love, vulnerable young states, not belonging. There is no place for me. Everyone I love leaves. Alone, fear of being alone, accepting being alone. You get the picture. I'm doing a better job than ever to allow and not suppress this material and rest in the self, the awareness in which all this painful stuff emerges. It requires strong effort, though, to get it together and make myself stable in order to go to work and be there, present, open, and focused on my clients. At the end of the day, I feel better myself. Yet in the night and morning, the same familiar friends, ghosts come by. And this day after day. Is this my current yoga exercise? I guess so, yes. Questions. 1. What's the point of all these seeming losses? What lesson am I supposed to get? Getting rid of the old so that the new has some room to come in. That's the lesson. Any recommendations you have after reading the above self-diagnosis to keep enjoying the beauty of the infinite? No, you have to be realistic. If you have some sense of lack, you cannot pretend it's not there. But you have to understand it. You have to allow for it to come to the surface. Number 2, how to differentiate between the me feeling of separation arising from the feeling of lack and the legitimate and human desire to be in a meaningful, loving partnership in the truth and have a family. I feel I have unconsciously always avoided that, rejecting this vision. It's we are genetically programmed to have children and a family to protect. And a partner to love. We have to recognize this conditioning, which is part of our DNA, and use it as a tool for celebration. But not to see the fulfillment of these goals that are inherent to the human body-mind as the source of happiness. We have to find the happiness within, and then celebrate it in our life, wherever and however our life wants to guide us. Through relationships, through children, family, and friends, and travels, and jobs, and it's an exploration. And of an uncharted territory. But we have to see it not as a chore, but rather as a joyful journey, interesting journey. But we have to be prepared for the journey. And to be prepared means to have found within the source of love and beauty and truth and happiness. Peter, last week you explained on the direct path, space is consciousness-like. This means I, consciousness, perceives space. Therefore, space appears in me and is an object of me. It's not just, I'm deeply grateful to you for this clarification. Now the next issue. Until last week, I used empty space as a metaphor for consciousness without an object. I wonder whether this still makes any sense. Shall we say empty space is consciousness without an object like? Yes. But empty space is just an object in consciousness, which therefore is not consciousness without an object anymore. This is a bit like a koan. Could you please comment? Yes, it is an object which is consciousness-like, but which is not consciousness. And so then we are on the progressive path. And that's okay, because it's an object, a consciousness-like object, and consciousness-like objects have the power to dissolve in the experience of consciousness. So they are, if you will, stepping stones. That's a way on the path. We are using two tools. We are using the logical tool and the analogical tool. The logical tool is used to destroy false belief systems. That's the essential use of it. The analogical tool is more interesting. It uses metaphors, images. And it takes us to the experience, to the glimpse. The logical tool is like a bulldozer that removes the obstacles on the path. And the analogical tool is the engine that drives us, the vehicle that drives us on the path. For instance, the space analogy with consciousness. You see, if we see consciousness as an object, it would have a location in space, like in the brain, for instance. It would be brain-like. It would be also, it would have physical qualities such as color, texture, mass. Then we take the analogy of space and we observe that space is everywhere, meaning between the objects, the physical objects, that's where we see it first. But of course, it is also where the physical objects are. They occupy the space. But the space is there, which they occupy. So the space is everywhere. And also, when some portion of the space is occupied by an object, the space is not affected by the object. So the physical space is a much better analogy or image to describe consciousness than the brain image as a piece of meat localized in the skull somewhere. You see, so already by using these images, these metaphors, they take us a long way along the path. Anyway, that's how it works. Most of the time, an image, a metaphor, and we are the glimpse. It's not different in a way from the way we understand solution to problems that arise for us. We have images in the mind that evolve, and at some point they dissolve, we get the solution. It's the same here, but then the subject of our investigation is consciousness itself instead of being some daily life issue. Luciana. So it is not that God forgets she is causeless happiness. It's that she pretends to forget so as to keep experiencing all the emotions deriving from ignorance in order to be happy. No, it's not in order to be happy. If you're happy, for no reason. And the thought comes to you, okay, let's go to a restaurant and have a nice dinner, or let's open up a bottle of champagne. You are not going to the restaurant to be happy. You are not opening the bottle of champagne to be happy. You are opening the bottle of champagne because you are happy. It's not the same thing. It's called celebration. So I read again. It's that she, God, pretends to forget so as to keep experiencing all the emotions deriving from ignorance in order to be happy. No. Because she is happiness itself. Whatever she does is simply a celebration of her. So I keep reading. That's an altogether different game. It does not sound not loving unless one forgets that as separate being, one is nothing and that everything is made of God. Yes. But it seems to me that whatever happy feeling one can derive from the experience of objects, it is nowhere close to the causeless happiness through which God understands herself to be. An understanding which precludes forgetting. No. No, because it is true when we forget and when we rediscover her, there is the happiness inherent in her, but there is a state of relief in the body and in the mind. We had lost her, now we found her again. So this state of relief is impermanent and can be very intense. Unlike the peace we go back to, which is the happy peace. Now, there is this tendency to value the intensity of the impermanent relief over the peace. Over time, we learn that the real value is in the peace. And therefore, the experience through which God understands herself to be, an understanding which precludes forgetting. The forgetting is not important, is not necessary. Otherwise, we are still going through ups and downs. The forgetting is in fact part of the problem. Then she goes on, so would you please elaborate your answer further? Why do all beings chase their limited happiness through a pretense game, which furthermore blinds them to the beauty and perfection of the universe, if they have always been causeless happiness? Your question is based upon the assumption that there are many beings chasing limited happiness through a pretense game. There is only one being who enjoys all the games. There are people like that. They like all the games. When they don't play tennis, they play poker. Any questions here?
I keep having this question, even though it might be a little on the silly side. It just keeps coming over and over. We talk about Santa Claus and letting go of the belief of Santa, and I say there must be some kind of benevolent conspiracy to have the children believe in Santa Claus. As the decorations go up, there are adults who are perpetuating this. Is there some sort of conspiracy, benevolent or not, to keep us in ignorance?
Oh yes. We are, it's a conspiracy of one. The moment we choose ignorance out of our freedom, the universe gets it, because the universe is our instrument. And therefore, the universe is going to go into as far as the pseudo-entity, human body-mind, through which we choose to play this game. It will go into ignorant mode. In other words, all the events are going to appear consistent with this consciousness being separate, if you will. So it could be said that the universe conspires at that moment to make it feel real, that we want to play the game, and the universe says, okay, if universal consciousness wants to play the game, I'm the servant, here we go. You see? And the opposite happens when we, as universal consciousness, decide to stop playing the game. Then the entire conspiracy in the universe switches into a different mode. And what is interesting is this, is that this universal intelligence is so intelligent that for the ones who play the game of ignorance, the same events will be consistent with ignorance, and for those who don't play, for those in which consciousness doesn't play the game of ignorance, the same events will be consistent with wisdom. You see? It's very beautiful. It's a mind-blowing intelligence.
So there's not a group of powerful people in, I don't know, Western Europe, that's Eastern Europe even.
It's all in our power. It's a power of one, you know. The moment that's what Krishnamurti used to speak of, the first and the last freedom, we are free as consciousness, as universal consciousness. But the moment we choose ignorance, this choice is the last exercise of our freedom. And then, when we are in ignorance, the moment we choose to question ignorance, that's the first exercise of our freedom. So we go down into this basement of ignorance and in the jail of slavery, if you will. And there is one way in, and there is one way out. The last freedom and the first freedom. And once we are in this dark basement, we are the prisoner. And we never see that, in fact, the jail, the door of the jail is open. We can leave at any moment. But we look the other way. We keep looking towards the place through which we came. This choice we made to be separate. And that sounds very... The problem when I say that is that it sounds so... For many so far, like, oh yes, Francis, he says that, but I don't see it. I don't see this freedom in my case. Where is this freedom? How can I exercise it? You say that's a good question. And this freedom to choose ignorance is precisely in the fact that there is no evidence that consciousness is limited. And that therefore, if I believe that it is limited, I'm exercising my freedom. But this exercise of my freedom has consequences. You see? We exercise our freedom by choosing to identify with something else than consciousness. That's all. When we were born, I guess his identification was not there. At some point, we have chosen it. Of course, as universal consciousness, we chose also the conditions of our birth, our parents, and so on. But nevertheless, we were free, and at some point, we have chosen to be a separate consciousness in spite of the absence of evidence. We don't remember when it happened, but it has happened. Just as we don't remember when we started believing in Santa Claus, but obviously, as a newborn infant, we had no clue about Santa Claus, right? Later on, age 3, we believe in Santa Claus. So between age 0 and age 3, at some point, we have adopted this belief, right? We don't remember. The fact that we don't remember when doesn't eliminate the truth that at some point we have started believing. Right? At some point, we have adopted this belief. We don't remember when, the circumstances, but it has happened. In hindsight, because obviously we didn't believe in Santa Claus when we were born. Same thing here. When we were born, we didn't believe to be a separate consciousness. We had no clue about consciousness, about us being human or whatever. At some point, we have adopted this belief. And just as, in the case of Santa Claus, our parents have contributed, in the case of ignorance, our parents have contributed too, of course. But nevertheless, we were free. We cannot impose a belief to someone. at some point we have to, there is a submission, and at that moment we sell our soul to the devil, talking about malevolent forces.
Hi, but it doesn't feel like we really had a choice, because it doesn't seem that it was clear what we were doing when we sold our soul to the devil. It seemed like, I think, we've only bought this because we thought that it was true.
Sometimes we alienate our freedom. We alienate our intelligence. The fact is that if we believe something to be true, in the absence of any factual evidence, at some point we have exercised our freedom.
So if you trust someone to tell you the truth, that is giving up your freedom in a way.
Oh yes, definitely. Especially politicians.
Francis, when you say that we chose to be a separate entity, or we chose to believe we're limited, you mean we as consciousness?
Yes.
Yes. So it's kind of tricky, because we didn't know we were consciousness, but yet, so...
Wait a minute. We knew we are consciousness.
Okay.
Consciousness knows itself. We don't know that we are consciousness because we have learned it or because it has begun at some point. Perhaps we were hearing the word I, right? The word. And then at some point we say, okay, oh, that's me. Oh, I'm the perceiver. But the identification between the perceiver and the body-mind and the body is something that for which there is no evidence. So the way it works is that if your parents are telling you, are you hearing me? You say, yes, okay. So I then becomes that which hears, right? So you, when my parents say you, it refers to consciousness. But then the parents say, oh, look how he has a beautiful skull, or like he has a beautiful little feet, you know. So then, you is now connected to the little feet and to the, you see. But these are apples and oranges, you see what I mean? So at some point, to identify that which is hearing with the little feet or the beautiful whatever, if it is a boy, but don't want to be too serious.
It seems like, on the surface level of my life, that it was kind of laid out to unfold in a certain way. And, like as you have said, somehow we chose our family situation, etc. And
We as consciousness.
We as
Consciousness chooses everything.
Yeah.
Yes.
yeah. So, yeah, okay.
But it chooses everything in two ways, externally by the kind of parents we have, the circumstances, but also internally we have to recognize this freedom, and that's the important point, that because we had it, we still have it, and we will always have it, this freedom to believe or not to believe. As Shakespeare used to say. He left the leave, but it was in the mistake in the manuscript. Cody, my question is about the topic of action. It comes from the discussions that took place last weekend. You made the distinction between two types of actions, those actions we decide to do and those that are spontaneous. Yes, that are spontaneous, perhaps not, but mechanical, I would say, rather than spontaneous. In the former, it is always a deciding thought that initiates actions we decide to do, deliberate action. Contemplating this, I'm having trouble finding where my freedom in action comes from. It would seem that spontaneous action is the only free action, yet I feel that I have the freedom to choose what lines of thought to act upon. Although I may not choose the thoughts, it feels as though I have the ability to refrain from acting upon a thought. But after thinking this over, it seems that even the refraining from action is a decision as well, a deciding thought to refrain. Exactly, you are right. Is our freedom found in the understanding that all action comes from God and that we confuse our actions to be a body-mind decision rather than His deed? Yes. This reminds me of a poem by Hafez that says something akin to God's secret is that the only one to blame is Him. Absolutely. I don't have the poem in front of me, unfortunately. I'm sure he said it much more eloquent than that. Yes, it's very true. There is only one doer, only one decider, which is God or consciousness. But that seems depressing if we identify with a limited entity. Because then, yes, we discover that as a limited entity, we have zero freedom. So that's the bad news. And if we stay there, I agree, to believe to be a separate entity was already depressing, but hearing that, it becomes even more depressing. The good news is that we are not a separate entity, and that this sense that there is freedom, that freedom exists, this sense that we are inherently free is correct. It comes from our experience, the deepest experience of consciousness, of freedom. So it's correct. It's just that we are not free as a separate entity, but as consciousness. So as a limited entity, we believe to have some limited freedom. Even this limited freedom, we lose it through intelligence. But then, as universal consciousness, we regain absolute freedom, total freedom. So that's, if you will, the path. But what you said was correct. I just elaborate a little more on it. Mahmoud, I have an almost 2-year-old boy and 3-month-old girl. The happiness recipes that my parents taught me didn't work. Get high grades in school, have a high salary job, get married, and have children. I understand that they did that lovingly to the best of their knowledge, and I feel grateful towards them. Is there a way for me to maximize the likelihood of my children being happy when they become adults? That's a very good question, Mahmoud. And 2 things. First, maximize your happiness by seeking the truth. Now, as their father, do your best to preserve their enthusiasm. It's normal for a child to explore, to discover the world. Each individual body-mind has its own ways of doing it. And there is an innate intelligence. So the parents have to be a gentle, following force rather than a guiding force. It's better to answer questions than to give orders as a parent. Because the question comes from their enthusiasm, so their desire to discover. An order is a kind of a dead end, it's a blocked place. So preserve their enthusiasm. Be with them as much as you can in their discovery of the world. It's something, when the child is newborn, the parents, because they cannot yet speak to him to communicate, they have to be silent and to observe the child. And right? And they say, oh, look how now he can reach for the colored things, and now he can hold the hand, and now he recognizes my face, etc. They have to be passive. They cannot yet impose anything onto the child, right? So this attitude of openness, of letting the child come to you, has to be kept even when the ability to communicate with the child and to dictate orders get established. We have to be in support of it, of his or her discovery of the world, and know that their enthusiasm is the most precious thing. Because their enthusiasm is also their joie de vivre. We have to be happy with them. We have to be happy with them. And unfortunately, the education is designed to make children servants of the state and servants of the corporations. In the capitalist system, servants of the corporations. In the socialist system, servant of the states. None of this system is very good because they are always servants. The proper education would be to allow for the child to explore so that they follow their enthusiasm and they discover their skills and their talents, their innate talents and their preferences. We are all different. Of course, that would lead eventually to a society in which we would produce less plastic tools, plastic stuff. Perhaps a society with more artists and discoverers and cooks and winemakers and gardeners and scientific researchers, people who do things out of vocation. But that's not the world we live in. We cannot change the world. But within our realm of responsibility as parents. Also, last recommendation. Always give them the maximum level of freedom which is possible given their current age and maturity. Always give them the maximum freedom. And usually, as a dad, you have to fight the mother. Because the children have to be allowed to fall, for instance, and to get burned. There are experiences we all have had. Now, if we fall when we are very young, first, we don't fall from too much height. Second, the bones are very flexible, and so falling then is not too much of a problem. If you prevent your children from falling at some point where they are 16, 20, 25, they will have to fall someday. And then it will hurt. So that's a metaphor, of course. But give them the maximum freedom. Same thing with when they become teenagers, you know. But what is important is to do that very early on. Because then they know that they are responsible for their own well-being. And then they will listen to you. Tell them, you know, fire burns. Okay, they want to try it. Want to put your finger on top of the candle? It's going to burn. But I'm going to catch your hand and prevent you from doing it. And then burns, cries, kisses, and the experiment has been conducted. Now, they will trust you. They will trust you. So when they are adults or teenagers, you know, they get their first car, they tell them, okay, in the beginning, you know, drive slowly, follow the rules very carefully, etc. They will follow you because they trust you, you know, and because it's important to develop this trust. So they have to be allowed to live their lives, basically. for some reason. I've lost. No, Emmerich, the other day has been ignorance day for me. I started it full of good intentions to conduct the experiments you suggest, especially when I am with my wife these days. I am trying to remember and feel that we are one consciousness and there is no person. I do not tell her, of course. As I assume for many couples, there are behaviors of the other or habits, way of acting you dislike, and that have the power to drive you mad. That day, based on the above, I jumped from inner tensions to nasty remarks to my wife, then to feeling of guilt, then back to more tensions. In a nutshell, the vicious circle. What is crazy is that I never forgot intellectually about the truth during this day, but my body-mind answered differently and closed itself to the other. I could really experience that as a separate entity, even with good faith to act impersonally. I could not control all my actions. I could see all my patterns. I draw the conclusion that the ignorant choices I have made are rooted deeper in my body. So I have to set up my headquarters deeper as well, and not only in my head. At the end, it was nothing so harmful, just an ignorant day. Do you have any comment or advice based on this experience? Do I interpret it correctly? Not really. Because if you recognize this day to be an ignorant day, you are not that ignorant after all. See? When you are really ignorant, you don't know that it was an ignorant day. So there is this awareness in it. And this awareness already changed the experience. Now, what I would suggest is what we do in this case can always be fixed. As soon as you realize it, don't beat yourself up saying, oh, I acted as an ignorant. Because it's not you. It's consciousness who did it. Don't look back. Whatever happened in the past was God's doing. In the now, you're responsible. So what can I do to fix what was done? You know, I said that to my wife. Then I say, I'm sorry, I apologize. That was stupid of me. I don't know what took me, you know. I love you, I apologize. I was so rude or I was so insensitive or whatever. And that's it. You do your best. And then you leave that on the table. You know, she takes it or she doesn't. But it will always have its impact because it came from the right place. So it will always go to the right place. Perhaps in the beginning, she will say, but nevertheless, it will have gone to the right place. She will have to think about it. Okay, thank you.